Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome. I am Jackson Malkus. I am the Outreach and Events Coordinator here at Friends Place. And I'm joined this evening by Lean Sultan, the Advocacy Manager for UNRWA USA. If you're not familiar with Friends Place, we are the guest house and civic education center partnered with FCNL on Capitol Hill in Washington, D.C. We're a Quaker guest house. We welcome all people coming to D.C. for reasons of faith, advocacy, or service. We often host events like this one at least once a month, community events that are tied around FCNL's issues. For those who are not familiar, FCNL is the Friends Committee for National Legislation. That is the Quaker lobbying organization in the US that works on issues like peace, justice, and environmental stewardship. And this evening, we're going to be discussing a really urgent and timely issue. We're going to be discussing the humanitarian crisis in Gaza. We're going to be discussing the organization UNRWA and what they are doing to try to alleviate that crisis. We're going to be talking about the importance of restoring US funding and support. We're going to be discussing some of the negative narratives and disinformation that have been propagated around UNRWA and how we can challenge those narratives in our own lives with people that we know and also with our elected officials as well, to try to get the support that we need to this vital organization. So before we get started, I'm going to ask that we approach this topic, a really emotional and sensitive and charged topic, with care with each other. And what I mean by that is that for friends joining online, we have a couple friends here in the room. Hello, friends in the room. We're gonna follow community norms and respect by not interrupting and talking over each other. If we're joining online and we're in a segment where we're inviting participants to ask questions or give comment, we ask that you'll raise your hand before unmuting to speak, and that otherwise you'll keep yourself muted. And we'll ask that when you're engaging with people in the chat, whether it's us, whether it's other participants, you'll be caring and respectful and thoughtful about who they are and where they're coming from. So without further ado, I will quickly give an overview of our schedule for the evening. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the current state of the crisis in Gaza. I think many people in the room tonight have their own knowledge and relationship to this crisis. And I'll share some facts. We'll share a short video, and then we'll be asking to hear from you in the chat about what information, what facts, what stories, what media you consume really deeply impact you on this crisis or touch you if you're interested in sharing. Then I'll quickly introduce UNRWA at a really high level, basic introduction. Lean will help support me in doing that a bit. And then we'll take some time, about 30 or 45 minutes, to talk with Lean, to ask her questions about UNRWA and UNRWA USA and her work. And during that time, we'll be encouraging all of you to put questions you have for Lean into the chat. I'll be posing her some questions, but please, as questions occur to you, put those in the chat. We'll be keeping an eye on the chat, and we'll try to make time for as many of those questions as we can. After that, we're going to address some of the most commonly kind of repeated claims of disinformation against UNRWA. And we're going to talk about the facts that kind of run against those claims. And we're going to provide resources so that people can be fully informed about the work UNRWA is really doing and the steps it is taking to ensure neutrality. And at the end, we'll take a little bit of time to talk about action steps and what we might be able to do with our advocacy to try to support and restore funding to UNRWA. Okay. So the crisis in Gaza has been devastating for the people experiencing it and the people around the world who have had to witness that since October 7th, over 45,000 Palestinians have been killed, over 1 million have been displaced. Thousands of people have had their homes destroyed, the buildings in their communities turned into rubble. There's been very little access to critical needs for survival. It's recently been reported that 2/3 of Gaza's population are consuming less than 6 liters of water per day. That's way below the international standards needed for drinking and cooking, which is usually considered to be a minimum of 15 liters to address daily hygiene needs as well. Food insecurity is rampant. Many people are surviving on just 1 meal a day or even less. There's a healthcare crisis. Hospitals are overwhelmed or not functioning at all. Many do not have electricity or potable water. Medical evaluations are extremely limited or restricted, so very easily preventable deaths are not being able to be prevented right now. Civilians in the tens of thousands are injured, many of them children, and they are not able to access the care that they need. So I want to take a moment and share a video that zooms in on the food insecurity element of the situation in Gaza. I'm going to pause my sharing briefly as I pull that up. This is around a 3-minute video. And after we watch it, I'm going to ask all of us to observe a bit of silence. And I welcome people to share in the chat their feelings about what aspect of the crisis, what information, what stories that they're holding most closely and are most deeply impacted by.
These are the faces of hunger in Gaza, a crisis affecting hundreds of thousands of people in the besieged enclave, like this group of children at a soup kitchen in Khan Yunis, crushed by the crowd, pots clanging, begging for handouts. I can't breathe, said this girl as she pushed against a metal barrier. Others cry in pain. Their bodies squeezed by a sea of human misery all around. Arms lifted in the air. The girl is pulled out, losing a shoe on the way up. The United Nations assessment in October concluded that 1.8 million people in Gaza are experiencing, quote, extremely critical levels of hunger. Our team follows Sama back to her tent. She empties the little rice she managed to secure onto a plate. They tell us This will be all the family has to eat today. Her husband Issam, displaced from Rafah, says he feels helpless. I can't feed them. I can't get them water, he says. I prefer death to this. I can't do it. I can't do it, he repeats again and again. In central Gaza, a compact crowd outside a bakery, hundreds trying to buy bread. Little by little, the horde swells, and the swarm of people sways back and forth and from side to side, body against body. Shortly after these images were filmed, 3 women were crushed to death. 17-year-old Rafah was one of them. Her father, Osama, falls to his knees. It's enough, God. We are tired, God, he screams. For those left behind, the hunt for food will begin anew the next day. The human rights group Amnesty International yesterday released a report accusing Israel of genocide in Gaza, saying it uses starvations, among other methods, as weapons of war. Israel, for its part, denies blocking aid and says that the report is, quote, entirely baseless. Back to you. Thanks for watching.
Friends, I'm gonna invite us again to observe some silence and to share in the chat their thoughts or feelings about what elements of the humanitarian crisis are standing out to you, what stories you've heard or things you've seen that are affecting you most powerfully. And if you're in the room and you would like to share, you can just raise your hand and I will bring the mic over to you to share out as well. So we'll sit for a minute. Friends, I want to share a piece of information that has been heavy on my heart that I read the other day. It's particularly upsetting to me the way children are being impacted by this crisis. And I saw a survey had been conducted of children in Gaza, where I believe of 500 respondents who were children, 97% of them said that they believe that their death is imminent. And around half of the children surveyed had said that they wished that they were dead because of the trauma they had experienced. Um, yeah, that's one that's been sitting with me. Sarah Avery is sharing in the chat. I keep thinking of the generational trauma that those living in Gaza have already been living out, and the much higher levels of immediate trauma that these people, especially the children, will need so many resources to address for decades and generations to come. Jim Hafemeyer from Minnesota says, I am paying for Israel to do this when I pay taxes. I never imagined I would be involved in such evil. Lauren Brownlee shared, I cried today reading poetry out of Gaza. It is hard to be broken open by the words and images from Gaza, but I feel a responsibility to bear witness and to act. Thank you, friends, for sharing out. Please, we welcome you to continue sharing in the chat. Something that came up, oh, sorry about that. Something that came up in the video we watched was Amnesty International's statement about what Israel was doing and that they believed it was a genocide and that Israel was starving people in Gaza. And something I've seen our team at FCNL write and state is that Gaza isn't starving, it's being starved, right? And so tonight we want to talk about UNRWA, an organization, probably the preeminent and most important backbone aid organization in Gaza that is working to try to deliver the aid to respond to that starvation. We're going to be talking about the important role that they play, what they do, and how we can support them. So at a really high level, UNRWA is involved in almost all of the aid operations in Gaza, in the sense that they have 13,000 staff members who are involved, whether it's in food distribution, medical support, cleaning water or providing water, providing all kinds of different resources in terms of shelter, education, really all elements of aid more or less are touched by UNRWA as an organization in some way, shape, or form. But UNRWA doesn't just work in Gaza. UNRWA stands for the United Nations Relief Works Agency in the Near East. And so it operates serving Palestinian refugees since 1949, after the Nakba, all throughout the Middle East with refugees, not just in Gaza and the West Bank, but also in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan. In Gaza in particular, over 1.7 million people are registered as refugees, Palestinian refugees, which makes UNRWA the largest humanitarian actor in the region in total. Its facilities, which it has over 300 of in Gaza, are critical to provide places for shelter, for medical intervention, for education. And the staff on the ground working for UNRWA fill a kind of unique position in the sense that many international aid workers are not able to access Gaza at all. Staff members for UNRWA are based in Gaza already, and so are able to provide that access directly. Lean, is there any other kind of key background information you want to add about UNRWA?
Sure, I would love to. I think just going off of your last point, something that's really unique about this particular UN humanitarian agency is that the majority of UNRWA staff are Palestine refugees themselves. So as opposed to typical UN or other NGO humanitarian agencies, you'll get a lot of internationals, but these are refugees serving their own communities and their own people. And particularly in Gaza, they are living through the same circumstances as everyone else, starving at the same time and still showing up to work every day. And just another important point to mention about, you know, being the backbone of all aid operations in Gaza, and you also mentioned 1.7 million registered refugees. That's 80% of Gaza's population are refugees, meaning that they fled to Gaza, to the Gaza Strip, during the Nakba in 1948 and beyond. My family and my dad's side's actually refugees from Gaza that fled from the north down to the Gaza Strip. And so just, you know, kind of important framing in this context that, you know, at this point, 90% of the population is displaced from their homes. Everyone is displaced from their homes or destroyed, but these are people who have been repeatedly displaced for the last 76 years, and were already refugees to begin with.
Thank you. Thank you for building that out. And I think now that we've kind of given this very general introduction to UNRWA's work, we're going to transition into taking some time to pose some questions to Lean about the work of both UNRWA and UNRWA USA and her work. I'm going to start off by posing Lean some questions, but I would encourage friends in the chat, please do just drop your questions in there as we go, and I'll be keeping an eye on the chat to try to pose those questions to Lean. For friends in the room, if you have questions that occur to you, you can just put your hand right up and I'll come over and bring the mic over so that our friends online can hear your question as well. So I think to begin, I wonder, Lean, if you can explain the distinction between UNRWA and UNRWA USA.
Yes.
And what UNRWA USA's kind of mission and goal is as it relates or maybe differentiates in whatever ways from UNRWA more generally.
Sure, thank you. And first, I just want to start by thanking everyone for being here in person, online. I know it's you know, end of the year, we're all getting in holiday mode, and the fact that you're all here on a Tuesday evening to learn and just be with us, it really means a lot. So thank you, and thank you to Friends Place for putting this together so thoughtfully. But as Jackson mentioned, the advocacy manager at UNRWA USA, and we are a independent American nonprofit that supports the work of UNRWA, the UN agency, through fundraising and advocacy here in the United States and Canada as well. So we technically are UNRWA North America. But really important distinction that we are not the UN agency. I'm not a UN employee. However, we work closely with the UN, and we just try to get people here in the US to understand the mission, its mission and scope. So my role as advocacy manager is to activate, you know, grassroots advocates like you, to take action. And fundraising is a really big part of our work that we do. And, I'm proud to say, although it's difficult, difficult to find the proper adjectives to describe feelings these days, but the way that, the American people have stepped up when our government has stepped back, we've really seen that in our donor base. For example, before October 7th, we probably had about 7,000 donors, and our donors are, just everyday people just like you. And we now have over 80,000 donors, and we have become one of the largest funders to the agency globally. So as you may or may not be aware, UNRWA, the UN agency, is funded by UN member states, but also by private entities like us. And so we have been the 5th largest global donor to the agency, ahead of many other UN member states. So I think that just speaks a lot to the will of the American people and what, people's priorities are, and how our government's not reflecting them right now.
Yeah, I think that's so true. And I want to share a key piece of context that I buried the lead on, and some may not be aware of, is that in January, the Biden administration and the US government made the decision to stop US funding to UNRWA. And we're going to talk a little bit about the reasoning that was given for that decision, how UNRWA responded to that decision, and later why it is so important for us as soon as possible to be pushing our government, our elected officials, to make a case to restore that funding to UNRWA. Lean, I'm wondering if you could talk to me a little bit about some of the specific aspects of UNRWA's work, programs, or initiatives that have stood out to you, that you have seen really directly and meaningfully impact refugee communities.
Sure, I would be happy to. And I just always, want to go back to the important context that you provided at the beginning of this. We're currently, for over the last year, we're hearing UNRWA in the context of Gaza and the Gaza Strip. But it is important to remember that UNRWA operates in 5 fields across the region, as you mentioned: Gaza, the West Bank, including East Jerusalem, Lebanon, Syria, and Jordan. And that providing services to 5.9 million refugees across the region. So obviously, well, it should be obvious, but I guess, to some people it's not. UNRWA is the backbone of the humanitarian operation in Gaza. There's no doubting that, despite what you might hear. But beyond the emergency assistance that UNRWA provides, it is unique in that it provides government-like services to its beneficiaries. And so, that includes education, healthcare, protection, social services, camp infrastructure and improvements. UNRWA, again, before many of them have been destroyed or shut down, but there are 58 recognized UNRWA camps across the region. And you have to also recognize that, when UNRWA was first established in 1949 as a temporary agency to provide support to the some 750,000 Palestinians that were displaced, as we're seeing today in 2024, makeshift tents were set up. And that's how people were sheltering. And now there are people who have spent their whole entire lives and had families and generations that are being raised in these refugee camps. And so that's a big part of UNRWA's work that I think I'm trying to highlight the other pieces that aren't getting as much attention, because it's really important to recognize that, yes, the frontline humanitarian emergency response is a huge piece of the agency's work, but the other services that it provides are unmatched in that, the host governments where UNRWA operates are unable to provide those services themselves. And so when we think about, you know, in Lebanon, for example, the situation for Palestine refugees is very, very difficult. Palestine refugees are not included in the national economy. Work opportunities are very limited for Palestine refugees, and so UNRWA is one of the largest employers, providing job opportunities. Similarly, in the West Bank, it's the second largest employer after the Palestinian Authority. Beyond, you know, providing actual job opportunities, they also have a very robust like microfinance and loan program, which supports primarily women and other communities to, you know, provide income generating opportunities. Unemployment rate is extremely high in a lot of these areas, particularly in Gaza, the West Bank, and Lebanon. Those loan programs are really beneficial and important. So it's just some examples. I mean, I could really talk, we could have a whole session on just, you know, the different services that the UNRWA provides, and the biggest one really is education as well, primary education, and the health services. So just important to remember that it's more than what we're just seeing on the day-to-day with the emergency response.
That's an excellent overview of so many of the core and key services that UNRWA is providing. I just want to check real quick. I see a comment in the chat from JL saying it's difficult to clearly hear Lean. Can you raise your hand in the Zoom if it's difficult to hear Lean, or are most people hearing pretty well?
You can hear me?
Riley's saying it may be a little difficult to hear as well. Okay. Are people hearing me clearly? Raise your hand if you're hearing me clearly. People are. Okay, so maybe, Lean, if you want to unclip that, we will just pass this mic, the good mic, back and forth. Or if you want to test real quick with this one.
Can y'all hear me better now? Is it
No.
better? No?
People are still shaking their heads. Okay, so we'll pass this mic back and forth and share the mic. Okay, thank you for letting us know, friends. And I also see a question in the chat from Charlie. Lean, I'm not sure if you would know the answer to this, but I'll ask and see. Charlie is curious, roughly what percentage of donations to UNRWA USA goes to the UN agency UNRWA?
I love that question, and I do have the answer. All of our donations, so we exclusively support UNRWA, the UN agency. Beyond, you know, our indirect overhead rate, which is very low, only 4% right now, but everything that we are raising goes straight to UNRWA. There's nowhere else that we're sending the money, and where has been over the last year, primarily to Gaza, but we're also continuing to support the other fields as well.
Excellent. Thank you for that question, Charlie. And I'm glad it was a very straightforward answer. Oh, we have a question in the room. I'm going to go pass the mic, or Olivia is actually going to help me get the mic for the question in the room.
Thank you so much. I have a question about UNRWA's funding. I know you mentioned in January about US funding being cut off. I was kind of curious about what mechanism that was. Like, was that like an executive order, or just like the executive can just issue that, or was that a congressional bill? I know there's a lot of talk about like members of Congress, you know, having their input on it, but I wasn't sure in terms of how the UN, how our sort of funding for the UN as a whole is that mechanism compared to UNRWA's mechanism and all of that. So.
And I have a request in the chat if you could restate the question as you answer.
I will do my best, both to restate the question and to answer it. But the question is around how did the US stop funding, kind of through what mechanisms? And I just want to back up a little bit to give y'all more context about UNRWA funding in general and what that looks like, as I think it's just important framing for the conversation. So many UN agencies, there's pretty much two mechanisms that UN agencies are funded by. There's assessed contributions, which are a proportion of a UN member states based off of its, relative share of the global economy. Those are regular and those can be expected year by year. And then there are voluntary contributions, which that is how UNRWA is funded. So voluntary contributions means it's, as it says, it's totally voluntary. This also happens on a year-to-year basis, and so there's no expectation of funding, which, as you can imagine, can make it very difficult to plan ahead to the future. The United States has historically been UNRWA's largest donor, contributing between 30 to 40% of its budget. And this has always been the case up until 2018, when the first Trump administration pulled funding for UNRWA. And then the Biden administration restored that funding. And then, as Jackson mentioned, in January, paused the funding. And so going to your question about how, and again, I'm not an expert on this, so I'm only going to speak to what I know in terms of kind of how that went down. But originally it was, there's the US government gives kind of a set amount each year. It's been about between 350 to 400 million to the UN agency. And what Biden did was just to put a pause on distributing those funds. It was just, a hold, essentially a kind of probationary hold on distributing further funds. But then Congress actually put this statutory pause into the appropriations bill, which meant that pause would extend through the fiscal year. So right now, currently the pause on US government funding goes until March 2025. And there are efforts to extend the pause all the way through the end of the fiscal year through September. So knowing what we know about the new incoming Congress and administration, it's not looking that great for the funding situation. If you have anything you want to add, feel free, but I hope that answers some of your question.
Yeah, there's a question in the chat that really ties closely to how you just finished answering that question. And Christine asks, or says, Trump ended UNRWA funding in 2018. Won't Trump just end it again if we, the FCNL advocacy teams, who are going to be working on this issue of UNRWA restoration, get it restored? I have thoughts on this and maybe why it's still important for us to advocate kind of urgently right now. And I'd love to hear your thoughts as well. I mean, so yeah, it's quite likely that Trump, once in office, will end UNRWA funding again. That really is what makes this window of time between now and then so vital in terms of making a push with our elected officials in like the immediate future in early January to try and get some of this funding restored and sent in as soon as possible. And I want to pose a question a bit to Lean about what kind of difference this US funding can make. But Lean, is there anything you want to add on the concern of Trump ending the funding for UNRWA?
Sometimes I just laugh because I don't know what else to do. And these are very challenging situation. I wonder if, I know we're probably going to dig into later the UNRWA Restoration Act. Is that something we want to talk about now? Or
Let's introduce it.
Okay,
Yes.
okay, great. So again, just to give more important context and framing, a big part of both UNRWA USA's advocacy work and FCNL's, and a coalition of many other organizations have been working on this year since the January pause in funding, is to get bills introduced in the House and in the Senate to restore funding to UNRWA. So it's been a massive effort, really a group effort, and really proud to say that in September, I believe, Rep. Carson, Jayapal Chakowski, introduced the UNRWA Restoration Act, which essentially repeals the prohibition on funds and restores funding in the next appropriations bill. And so that was a big push that we've been working on, is to get as many House representatives to co-sponsor this bill, and it's at 71 right now, which shows really broad support for UNRWA in the House. And then importantly, kind of what was really exciting, just less than a month ago, Senator Welch's office introduced a Senate companion bill to the UNRWA Restoration Act. It's essentially the exact same bill with some updated information about, recent happenings, which we'll talk about more. So now we have a House bill and we have a Senate bill, and these are two very clear legislative vehicles that we as Americans can push on and push our elected officials to co-sponsor these bills and to continue to show that there is congressional support for restoring funding to UNRWA. And so right now that's I think the best that we have. And even though the future for these bills might be dark, the more that we can get the congressional support, to the showing of congressional support, the better it is for the agency in the future of funding, and 4 years later.
Yeah, and I want to quickly add here something about, I think, the unique space that a lot of FCNL's advocates occupy with their ability to have relationships and positive relationships with members of Congress who are conservative. And it may seem right now like these people would uniformly dismiss the possibility of restoring UNRWA funding, but I think we need to remember what some of these representatives are motivated by. For many of them, Israel's stability and security is deeply important, and there is a way of talking about the work that UNRWA is doing and could do at a higher level with greater funding that improves and supports and creates greater stability in the region and ultimately greater security for Israel, right? So more starving people, more struggling people living through humanitarian crisis breeds more violence, right? Like that's naturally connected. So if people are really concerned, if elected officials are really concerned with protecting Israel, they are going to do what they can to try to improve the humanitarian situation in Gaza. And that involves supporting UNRWA as a key first step. Richard in the chat asks, why are some legislators against this funding? Do you have a take on why legislators are against the funding?
Yeah, that's a big question. I think, there's many different existing false narratives around UNRWA and the agency, around the agency. But I think that they can all be boiled down to a specific political goal of Israel, which the UNRWA's Commissioner General Philippe Lazzarini just spoke about this in an interview, said it very well last week, that would be happy to share in the follow-up, that I think what it comes down to is that UNRWA is a reminder of the Nakba and of what happened to Palestinians and their and going hand in hand with that is their right to return to their homelands. And a common misconception is that getting rid of UNRWA gets rid of Palestine refugees and gets rid of their right of return. However, that's not true. UNRWA's mandate is very specific and clear. Their mandate is to provide services to Palestine refugees until there is a just and lasting solution to their plight. Until then, UNRWA's mandate continues to uphold. And a reminder is that mandate was, it's a temporary mandate that continues to be renewed. And as we all know, there is currently no political or just or lasting solution to their plight. And so that mandate is going to continue to hold despite what detractors in Congress or in the Knesset will say. And then I think another really important piece to remember is that the Palestinian right of return is not enshrined in UNRWA's mandate. It is actually enshrined in a separate UN General Assembly Resolution 194. And so even if UNRWA were to disappear, that mandate 194 promising the right of return to Palestinians is still there. So I think that's a huge part of I think why many legislators are against it. And then I'm sure, I know we'll talk about later all of the tropes and false narratives that people use to try to bring down the agency.
We have another question in the room.
Yes, Mark Harrison, I'm trying to understand the definition of refugees when it comes to this situation. Because Israel does not want there to be refugees, so therefore you are dismissed. You can go live in another country.
Mm-hmm.
And there are certain countries in the region, let's say Lebanon, I was told Syria, where, I don't know about Jordan, where Palestinian refugees live. Once they become citizens of those countries, are they no longer considered refugees at that point? And then on the right to return, you as an American can go back if you decide to go back, even if it's a Palestinian state. It's accepted right now. That's what I'm trying to get to.
Great question.
If you can restate it.
Oh,
Yeah.
yes. So the question is around refugees specifically in that definition. And if Palestine refugees are repatriated in other countries, do they lose their refugee status? Really good question. And I just want to kind of back up with what UNRWA has a very specific definition of what a Palestine refugee is. So you probably notice I'm saying specifically Palestine refugee versus Palestinian refugee. And that's because UNRWA's specific mandate serves Palestine refugees, which is specifically defined as a person whose place of residence was in Palestine between, I think, like 1946 and 1948. It's very specific dates, and the descendants of males. So with a lot of, this is another trope that you'll get, is that in every refugee population, refugee status is passed down from parents to children. That's not unique to Palestine refugees. So that's something else you might hear is, oh, it started with 750,000 and now there's 6 million Palestine refugees. Like they're, but actually the number is less because it's only passed through, the refugee status is only passed through the father. Now we're looking in a completely different context and situation in the Gaza Strip, where there were already, 80% of the population were already registered Palestine refugees, and that's who UNRWA serves. But now obviously we have, internally displaced people who are refugees, who are now internally displaced, and then obviously anyone who has fled from Gaza. Where I think, again, it gets complicated and confusing, and I think the kind of difference is, you know, all other refugees in the world are served by the UNHCR, which is the UN Refugee Agency. And their mandate is different. They actually do have a mandate to be able to resettle refugees in different countries. Whereas UNRWA specifically does not have a resettlement mandate. And part of that is to protect the right of return. And then I think going back to the other part of your question about Palestine refugees and the other host government. So Jordan is the only country that gave citizenship to Palestine refugees between 48 and 67, whereas no other host nations gave citizenship. So some Palestine refugees in Jordan have Jordanian citizenship, but it's not a full citizenship. They're still kind of like second-class citizens. They can't own land. It's just like a different kind of system. I'll stop there. I hope that answers most of your question, but if not, let me know.
We have another question here in the chat. I don't see a name tied to it, but it asks, to what extent do you expect other countries to step up to fill the void left by the US? Before I hand it over to Lean to answer, I will say that since the US suspended funding in January, when 15 other countries initially had suspended their funding as well, after UNRWA had responded to which I'll address now, kind of the initial allegations. There were allegations, verbal allegations from Israel stating that members of UNRWA were involved in participating in carrying out the October 7th Hamas attacks. And so after receiving those allegations, UNRWA did a really thorough review of the allegations, of the staff who had been accused, the 13 who had been accused, and ultimately made the decision after that review to terminate 12 of those 13 employees, and conducted a really deep review of his neutrality expectations and its ability to ensure that members of his organization, its staff, were not participating actively in the conflict one way or the other, which is explicitly against UNRWA's guidelines. After that review had been taken and those staff members had been terminated, the 15 US countries that include US allies like the UK, Canada, France, Germany, the EU, Japan, all resumed their funding. And only since then has the United States chosen not to resume its funding. So Lean, if you want to say anything else about to what extent other countries might be able to fill that void by the US, that would be appreciated.
Sure, I think that's, again, great context, and I just want to reiterate that the US right now is the only country that is continuing to withhold funds from UNRWA in the midst of the worst humanitarian crisis that we've seen in this, I think, ever. And so the UK was the last country to come back in recently. This kind of happened very gradually over time. And as the review that you were talking about was the Colonna report, which found that UNRWA has robust neutrality guidelines, and they did have already started implementing many of the recommendations that came from that report, and that's what brought in a lot of UN member states came back in. But in answer to Medea's question, since then, many other countries have stepped up in terms of, leveling up their support. So and I can't don't know off the top of my head, but there are some countries who increase their donations by a significant amount. And then UNRWA has also seen new donor states come in as well. So has been a global response to this funding pitfall, but as we all know, is the funding needs are greater than they've ever been before. And no matter what, because we are, the richest country, the most powerful country in the world, that lack of US funding is going, no matter who steps up and how, it's gonna have a huge impact. And I think going back to what I shared earlier about UNRWA USA and how we've seen our donor base grow, and how we've become one of the largest donors. Like, we've been able to raise and send about $50 million to support Gaza. That's amazing. And that is, more than we've ever raised in our 20-year history. But the US annual contribution is $350 million. So just, to put it into context, I don't think there's any other state that can fill that void.
Thank you. Nancy mentions in the chat, another talking point might be the shared risk of infectious diseases. Other than diseases well prevented by vaccination, it is impossible to keep infectious diseases in Gaza and out of Israel. Yeah, Alina, I wonder if you could share any stories you're seeing about some of the medical situations as it relates to infectious diseases in Gaza right now.
Absolutely. Where to start? As you look at any picture, read any reports, people are living in extremely overcrowded and unsanitary conditions. We all saw the resurgence of polio in Gaza for the first time in, I think, 30 years, and that resulted in a 10-month-old child becoming paralyzed. And we also saw the capability of humanitarian coordination to respond to impending polio outbreak, because diseases don't know borders, and there is a high risk that any diseases that are being contracted in Gaza can easily flow into Israel and surrounding areas. And that was, we've seen that there were the what did they call them specifically, the vaccine pauses to carry out this large-scale polio vaccination campaign, which UNRWA led along with partners at UNICEF and other NGOs. And I think that was a really great example of political will, and how when there is a clear and direct threat to the occupying power, they can actually implement a ceasefire and to stop hostilities to carry out a vaccination campaign. So polio is the big one that we're seeing, but there's so many others, like hepatitis is rampant. I know so many people personally, children who have hepatitis, skin diseases. Like, it's just, we can't even imagine. There's 1,000 people sharing one toilet. There's not clean water to drink or to wash. So it's very concerning, and we need, beyond thinking about it as from a public health epidemic perspective, but just from a purely human rights lens, like these conditions that people are being forced to live in are just unimaginable. And I think that going hand in hand with disease outbreaks, there's also that are the trash, right? No one's really talking as much about the trash. And I think, my background is actually in environment and conservation, and so this is something that I'm really passionate about. And that's something else that UNRWA does. An important piece of UNRWA's work is sanitation. But while bombs are falling, you can't pick up trash, and so there haven't been any kind of sanitation facilities have been completely destroyed. There's no ability for UNRWA or anyone to dispose of properly, safely trash, and so there's mountains and mountains and mountains of trash just piling in the Gaza Strip. And you're probably aware that Gaza Strip sits on the Mediterranean Sea. And so all of this trash is just flowing into the sea. And again, being a marine biologist at heart, I think this is a big issue that I want to get more attention is, the Mediterranean Sea is going to flow into the ocean pollution, it's all connected. Ultimately, what's happening there is directly going to impact what's happening to us here. And I think I just put that out there to anyone who is an environmentalist or, if that's the kind of lens that you're coming through, there's a very clear connection here. And also, with trash, infectious disease, hence the segue there.
Thank you for giving us that really big picture of how things are connected and sharing a little bit about your background. And I want to ask a question to hear a little bit more about what brought you to this work with UNRWA USA. Initially, what was your pathway here and the kind of background and experiences that led this to being a really important choice for you right now?
Thank you for that question. Always a little bit hard to know where to start to answer, but I am Palestinian American. My dad's side of the family is from Gaza, or they were from Kubaiba, refugees that fled to Gaza. And so my grandparents all lived through the Nakba, and growing up, I grew up in North Carolina as a Palestinian American in the rural South, and I always loved animals, environment, conservation, and so I pursued a path in marine biology and conservation, and that's what I spent the first part of my career doing. I used to actually be a sea turtle biologist, and I ultimately made a pivot because I felt called to do more to serve my people, and I really thought about, as I grew older and just came to understand what it means to be a Palestinian and what it means to be a Palestinian American, and all of the different things that my family went through and experienced for me to be here. I felt like I needed to do more with this privilege that I have as an American citizen. And so I started to pursue different paths. I ended up getting my master's in public health with a global health focus because I was passionate about, humanitarian work. Ultimately, I knew I wanted to serve my people. I didn't know where this journey was going to lead me. I moved to DC before I had this job. And I actually got my start in global health working in malaria. And I've been with UNRWA USA for a year and a half now. And I started, May of last year, so just 5 months before October. And I couldn't have imagined that this is where I would be now, but ultimately, I feel like it was where I was called and led. And, I think, interestingly, so something I was reflecting on the way here, just crazy how everything comes together. I was recently speaking with my great uncle, who was a Nakba survivor. All of my family is really excited about the work that I'm doing, and I'd shared I'm doing a lot with the Quakers and how the Quakers have been so wonderful and supporting the work. And he shared with me that he remembered the Quakers were actually the first group to come in 1948 to support Palestinians in Gaza, the Palestinian refugees that had fled to Gaza. And my great uncle, who's a Nakba survivor, remembered the Quakers being there first to serve. And so I just think, you know, here we are. It all comes full circle.
Thank you for sharing so much about your story and pathway. I'll pause and see if there are any other questions at this point in the room. Or provide an opportunity. We have one more question in the back. And if a friend wants to raise a hand in the Zoom for one more question before we move on, now is the time to do that. But I'll hand the mic over for the question in the room first.
Thank you so much. When we look at sort of this coming 4 years, maybe even this coming year, in terms of sort of getting people involved in this fight, maybe people who aren't sort of as up to date in this realm, like how do you recommend we do that? And also for you, even for me, like someone who's been, you know, keeping up with it, and who has been in like political circles, I'm also I found myself being lost in terms of how to sort of direct my energy. If you have any advice for that.
Thank you, and I'll just repeat, the question was about how to direct energy towards this fight. I can share that I also feel lost. I think that's a common feeling, and I think that's an important piece, is that when we're feeling that way, it's really important to lean into community. But on the more actionable front, I think a really big part of the work that we do at UNRWA is around narrative transformation, and it's about sharing stories of Palestine refugees and how UNRWA has affected their lives. Like, it's real people and real stories, and these are people just like us. And I think sharing those stories and uplifting those stories is like kind of the bare minimum that we can do. If you don't follow us already, make sure that you do, and that's, you know, a very clear way to get involved. And then, you know, taking it a step further in your advocacy, I think is, to me, it's the most important thing that anyone can do, is to continue to advocate and pressure your elected officials. And even though it might feel like you're screaming into a void, we have to keep doing it. We have to keep up the pressure. We have to do it every day, even when we're tired, even when it feels like nobody's listening and you're calling and you're emailing. But if we stop, they're not going to hear from us, right? And we know what we're up against. And so I think there's so many different ways that you can get creative, encouraging your communities and your circle of friends. If you want to host like action hours, power hours, where it's like, okay, let's get together on Friday and we're all going to call our elected officials, or we're all going to, like, you know, you could host a fundraiser. They're just continuing to spread the word and raise awareness as much as possible. And I think a really big piece, which I think you're trying to shift to, is pushing back against false narratives. And the way you do that is with sharing real stories. And so anytime you see those, if you see those being used, if you see those in the media, call it out for what it is. And following UNRWA, Friends, FCNL, we provide those resources and those stories for people to be able to do that.
Thank you so much. I wonder if you can hold your question until the very end so that we can get into our little bit of conversation about shifting this narrative and some of the disinformation. Is that cool? If you hold it for the last couple of minutes, and maybe if you hang on a little bit after we run out of time, we can address the question.
I've got to say one thing, please.
Is it a very quick comment?
Could you address the recent UN vote in the General Assembly where the US voted no on support for UNRWA?
So the question was asking about the UN General Assembly vote, and you was voting not supporting UNRWA.
That was last week, right?
Yeah, I mean, I think with the US not supporting, it just goes to everything that we've been speaking about already today. I think what's more important to see is the sheer number of countries that do support UNRWA and that voted yes. And it does show that the US remains to be the only holdout. Yeah.
Yeah, that's, thank you for making that statement. So thank you so much, Talene, for fielding those questions from me and from our audience. We're gonna use a little bit of the time we have left here to talk about some of the disinformation that has been propagated and spread about UNRWA. And I want to start by reading a quote from Commissioner General Philippe Lazzarini, right? And he said he believes the agency has been the target of a global disinformation campaign led by Israel that is premised on the misguided belief that if UNRWA disappears, so will the issue of Palestine refugees. Right? We talked earlier about Gaza not starving, but being starved, right? And the reality that for some members of the Israeli government, they believe that what they're considering the issue of the Palestinian refugees might go away if aid is withheld or prevented for long enough, or if the key backbone organization is prevented from being able to provide that aid. So I want to use a comment, it's a question, I guess, in the chat from Christine to segue us into this section. And Christine asks, has there been any response by UNRWA to the 12/9 New York Times article on Hamas records that were supposedly seized by Israel documenting 24 UNRWA school leaders involved in military Hamas and Islamic Jihad units? So the answer is yes, there has been a response. And Sarah Johnson is going to share in the chat right now a link to the UNRWA Facts versus Claims page. So I had prepared a couple of the most common kind of claims of disinformation to analyze, and this is what I'm familiar with, but had not prepared specifically for me, but I encourage you to use that link that Sarah Johnson has just shared in the chat. And to scroll through, it's a very detailed breakdown. And there is a section kind of addressing this specific claim, right? I can speak about it very generally in saying that my understanding is it refers to a Telegram group chat where individuals who are not necessarily like policing who is in or not in that group chat, or who is an UNRWA staff member or not otherwise, are kind of being implicated. I would encourage people to use the full link and review that case specifically. But I want to share my screen. And I want to kind of just quickly address some of these claims that I am seeing prominently or more frequently perpetuated. Something I'll mention at the front end of this is like, I'm not an expert on UNRWA. I really began educating myself about the work UNRWA does in the last couple of months as FCNL has become more heavily involved in the work. And something I very quickly found is that as you start to input UNRWA into your computer, your computer through algorithmic means will start to generate attack ads against UNRWA, links implicating UNRWA as being a terrorist organization and things of that nature. So there is a very clear effort being made to have the public image of UNRWA be presented to the US and possibly a global audience as well in a really negative light, right? And so one of the things that comes up most commonly is this idea that UNRWA staff in Gaza have very direct ties to Hamas, right? And it came up in the comment that was mentioned, and it kind of, I think, was propagated most popularly and originally with the allegations related to involvement in the Hamas October 7th attacks, right? And I mentioned earlier that at that time, UNRWA conducted an independent and external review of its neutrality measures and procedures. It began implementing greater transparency protocols and strengthening its oversight mechanisms to review. And it created a task force to oversee reforms and ensure compliance with neutrality standards, right? So these neutrality standards are very important to UNRWA. UNRWA works and has long worked in conflict zones. And in order to effectively provide aid, to provide support, it needs to ensure that staff members are remaining neutral, right? Now, I said earlier, there are 13,000 UNRWA staff members in Gaza, right? 12 of those 13,000 were ultimately found culpable by UNRWA for connection or participation in the October 7th Hamas attacks. So a very, very small percentage of the total staff. It's frequent as you look into the claims and allegations against UNRWA that they are typically not substantiated by evidence. They are statements made which UNRWA still dutifully investigates and observes and reports on, whether or not great evidence has been provided to the otherwise. It is key to the work that UNRWA is doing for them to make sure that they are in compliance with this neutrality expectation. And so they put a really high level of concern on that aspect. Lean, I don't know if there's anything you want to add on this piece.
Yeah, so I have a few things actually. Just going back to the question around the New York Times article and a lot of these, I think specifically around the New York Times article, you read the whole article and then at the very end it says the New York Times has not been able to independently authenticate any of these claims. Okay, then why did you publish them? I think that's a big issue and question that we see, is that so much is being taken for truth. And we've seen the way that that has been weaponized by Western media. There's no question there. There are even times with these allegations, Israel went to the media before going to UNRWA. And so then that's reported in the media before giving UNRWA any, chance to respond or react. But I think what's really important for people to know and to remember, and also to combat these kinds of tropes that you get, UNRWA is a underfunded humanitarian agency. It is not an intelligence agency. They do not run intelligence operations. However, Israel has an extremely robust, as we all know, intelligence, well-funded program XYZ. And as part of standard operating agreements, UNRWA provides a list of all of its employees to Israel as the occupying power and to any donor country who requests it. And so those names, the government of Israel has always had a list of all UNRWA staff names, and they have never expressed any issues with any names on that list up until very recently. actually for the last 13 years specifically. So I think that's a really important point to mention as well.
Thank you. So as our time is running light, we're gonna quickly move to try to get through two more really common claims. Something I see particularly online all the time or hear people is that UNRWA aid is diverted by Hamas. It's not getting to the people it's supposed to because Hamas is taking it or being given it. I'll reiterate again a issue with the allegations and that there are no specific allegations of any systemic diversion of resources by Hamas or any other armed groups, right? So this is kind of an idea or like a rumor that continues to be perpetuated, I believe, because maybe it's useful in dismissing the case for providing aid is just say, oh, the aid's not going to get there. Hamas is going to take it. UNRWA has a robust system of oversight for its aid distribution that involves a lot of checkpoint and review process at every stage. So it would be very difficult for UNRWA to not be aware. And when they do become aware of actions like this potentially happening, they will always report both to Israel and the Palestinian Authority that this has taken place. UNRWA, again, in alignment with its position with neutrality, takes a lot of measures to ensure it has no financial ties to any individual or organization that is on the UN Security Council consolidated sanctions list, right? Yeah, quickly, anything you want to add on to that one, Lean?
Sure, just quickly a reminder that as the occupying power under international humanitarian law, it is the obligation of Israel to ensure that humanitarian aid is provided and coordinated and facilitated to the Palestinian people. So as you said, it like these kinds of tropes are ways of getting out from under that obligation, but it is international humanitarian law that says Israel must facilitate humanitarian aid and entry, and they know everything that's going in and out of the strip, and so yeah, I'll stop there.
We're moving very quickly through now to our last of the more common claims, which is that other organizations can just step in and do what UNRWA does, right? We don't need to support UNRWA because other organizations can fill in the gaps. The facts are there is no other organization or body that has the history and the community connection and acceptance and knowledge that UNRWA has. There is not another organization that has the staff capacity, 13,000 staff and over 300 installations to provide and distribute and support the distribution of aid that UNRWA has. It's like the essential link in the current humanitarian chain, right? So for example, even if other organizations are supplying vaccines, UNRWA is going to be the organization that has the staff to actually administer those vaccines, right? So it's key for its ground capacity and staff capability in any aid operation. I want to read like a quote from Paul Spiegel, who is the director for the Center of Humanitarian Health at Johns Hopkins University. He says, "I have seen no concrete plan for any other group to take over from UNRWA." And he is concerned specifically about the UNRWA ban that Israel is going to implement after January 28th, which we should address here very quickly. And he says, it's going to be almost impossible for another agency to step in and quickly assume the role that UNRWA has played for so long. UNRWA has had years to establish logistics and people in the field. You just can't replace that overnight. So yeah, I mentioned it here. Israel is looking to ban on January 28th UNRWA in Gaza and the West Bank. Of course, this is not going to stop UNRWA's work. More generally, UNRWA will continue to support Palestinian refugees throughout the Middle East, in Syria, in Lebanon, in Jordan. And as we hear about possibilities for this conflict evolving, for the genocide to continue, and with the possibility that more refugees will end up in other surrounding countries, it's going to be as vital as ever for UNRWA to continue doing their work to support those people. Lena, I'll give you the opportunity here to talk about why UNRWA is vital, why another organization can't just fill that role, and maybe where UNRWA is still going to be super valuable in light of Israel's ban in January 28th.
Sure.
That's a lot. I'm sorry.
I think just going back to this first claim about other organizations being able to step in and do what UNRWA does. Every single NGO on the ground in Gaza has come out and said we cannot replace UNRWA, as they've been, tasked to, that people are searching for other replacements. Other UN agencies have also said we cannot replace UNRWA. Because as we mentioned, it has the infrastructure, has the know-how, has the community acceptability. Not only is it difficult to, change an entire system, just period. Imagine, you're at work and you have to change from like Google to Microsoft or whatever. How hard is that? Okay. Imagine in the midst of the worst humanitarian crisis with absolutely no resources, bombs falling, to try to change an extremely complex humanitarian system. It's just not doable. And we all know that. Israel knows that. The US knows that. The US has finally come out and said UNRWA is irreplaceable, after much too long. But going back to what you said about this ban, so this is really, really important and timely. End of October, the Israeli parliament passed 2 laws that will basically ban UNRWA from operating in the Gaza Strip, the West Bank, and East Jerusalem. And those laws are set to be implemented end of January. We don't know how they're going to be implemented. And right now there is no plan B. There is no backup plan. And the UN General Assembly vote that you mentioned was a global showing of how all but I think 9 UN member states support UNRWA's work and are against this ban. Now, again, remember that Israel is a UN member state, and they banned a UN humanitarian agency from operating. It doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense. We don't know what's going to happen, and we need to do everything that we can to keep sounding the alarm and spreading the word. And UNRWA remains operational, remains on the ground. UNRWA USA remains supporting UNRWA until we are told otherwise. We're not going away. And what happens after that date remains to be seen. But as Jackson said, this ban is specific to the occupied Palestinian territory. UNRWA will continue to operate in Syria, Jordan, and Lebanon as well.
Thank you, Lean. And we are just about at our time, but if friends can hang in for just another minute or so, minute or two, as we quickly go through what we can do urgently, immediately, and share out some links. I'll add that we'll be following up with an email to all registrants this Friday with some concrete action steps that can next be taken, along with recapping this event. So first, very simply, very quickly, it'll take you minutes. You can send an email to your members of Congress asking them to co-sponsor and pass the UNRWA Funding Emergency Restoration Act through FCNL. Sarah is going to share that link in the chat right now. It's something small, but in the aggregate, these messages can add up and be really impactful. So please do send that email to your member of Congress, urging them to take immediate action and co-sponsor the UNRWA Funding Emergency Restoration Act. You can also set up a lobby visit, right? We always hear that the most influential experience that a member of Congress can have is a constituent lobby visit. So especially if you are able to get a lobby visit set up between now and like mid-January or so, or in early January, it's even better. This is a really impactful time to have that conversation. And if you want support for planning and preparing for that lobby visit, please do a training with us here at Friends Place. Myself, my colleague Olivia Delaplane, who is our program coordinator, would love to work with you to make you as prepared as possible, along with our lobbying team, in order to make sure you can get the most out of that visit. Someone mentioned it in the chat earlier, but join an FCNL advocacy team, right? So this coming year, starting in January, sending aid, not arms, food, not bombs, is going to be the focus of our FCNL advocacy teams. These teams work all across the country to develop action, schedule lobby visits, and try to make an impact on the legislative process. And if you're interested in getting involved, you can reach out to Eleni Retta, who's in the room, our advocacy team's organizers. Sarah just dropped her email in the chat, and we'll be following up in post with that as well. You can donate to support UNRWA USA. And Lean, please take a minute and tell the people what their support could mean.
Absolutely, and thank you for the shout out. But yes, please, as I mentioned, right now, the only way that Americans can support UNRWA financially, because the US government stopped funding and our tax dollars are no longer funding the agency, is through UNRWA USA. So all of your donations to UNRWA USA go straight to UNRWA, and that will continue to be the case until we are told otherwise. And you know, right now is going to be a really important push to get those donations in. We are in, you know, end of year campaign right now, but also before this January implementation of this ban, we don't know what's going to happen after that. And so what's really important is to donate right now, and continue to do so, because that all of the money that you send to us will go to emergency assistance in Gaza, food assistance, shelter, all of those different things that are obviously so important.
Fantastic. Thank you. Thank you so much, friends, for taking this time to be here with us tonight. If you felt like you gained something from this program, if you want to continue attending events and experiences like this in the future, please also think about supporting Friends Place, friendsplacedc.org/donate, so that we can keep providing events like this as much as possible. Man, you guys were an incredible group of participants. The chat was just flowing with wonderful suggestions and questions throughout the evening. So thank you so much for your very active participation. Thank you, friends, for being here in the room, for making the effort to get out here. Appreciate all of you, and please take care.
Good night.
Good night.
Great
Bye,
talk.
friends.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank
Thank
you.
you.
Thank you.
Good job.
Thanks.
Thank you.
I
Good
got
night.
crazy
Night.
note. Good night.
Night. Thank you.